I've been asked to talk to you today about what do insects teach us about robotics, and perhaps we should, start with a simple question, which is, what do we mean when we say robotics? So what is a robot? You probably, when you say robot, everyone comes up with a mental image. Maybe, from cartoons and movies, it's something a bit more like this. If we think of robots robots that are actually used in the world today, many of them are like this. They're robots in factories, building cars and so forth. Or indeed, more and more robots in the home, such as a robotic vacuum cleaner. And this is a kind of a general definition, but I think a reasonable one of what a robot is. It's an intelligent machine that interacts with the world autonomously. So it both embodies intelligence, but also has this nature of being able to interact with the world on its own without humans having to interface to the world for the intelligent machine. And I would argue to some extent the intelligence is perhaps the easy bit. So if we think about chess, it's not easy, but we've pretty much solved the chess intelligence problem. We have computers that can outplay any human at chess, and certainly can outplay me at chess. On the other hand, what the robots and the intelligent machines have a lot of trouble with is interacting with the world. So if you imagine, if I'm presented with a chess set, it could be an arbitrary new chess set. You've probably all seen chess sets of multiple designs, of multiple sizes, to huge ones in parks, to tiny little travel chess sets with different size and sometimes completely, very stylized pieces and so forth. But I would immediately be able to recognize what the pieces were meant to be and to pick them up and move them. And any small child could do the same. But we don't have any robots that have that capability. So it seems like this interaction with the world is perhaps the part of robotics that we really haven't got very far towards solving yet. So maybe we can learn from how humans and other creatures interact robustly, flexibly, and adaptively with the world. So that's the kind of general inspiration for what you might call biorobotics or bio-inspired robotics. And of course, I'm not the only person who's thought of this or who works on these kinds of things. And if you say bio-inspired robotics, you probably think of things like a humanoid robot or the various types of dog-like robots, or indeed, swimming robots that look like fish, etc. So then you might be saying, well, why insects? And this is my quick argument for why insects. If we look at living things on this planet, the type of systems that I just talked about, humans or dogs or fish, etc., vertebrates in general, make up just a tiny part of the living things, so less than 0.5% of living things on this planet. Whereas invertebrates, which includes the insects, make up more than almost 81% of all living things. And this is just if you kind of count by the number of species, and if you actually do it account up by biomass, it's even higher, it's 93%. So they've clearly succeeded to some extent in getting on in the world. So that's fine. So you might say, okay, well, maybe that's good to copy, but then what about the intelligence? Do insects do anything, any kind of behavior that's intelligent enough that might be actually useful for robots? So what I'm going to do in this talk is really just focus on one specific example of that we've worked on. But I hope it will be illustrative of the general point that indeed we can learn quite a lot from insects. So let's consider, for example, a bee and the ability of bees to navigate along what's sometimes called the bee line. So as you may know, bees and quite a few other insects have a nest or a hive from which they forage, and they can fly out for very long distances on these long exploratory flights. And as soon as they find the food, they can go straight home again. So hopefully you can see that illustrated here. You have this long wiggly flight, but as soon as the food is found up in this corner, it can go back. And in fact, what the bee is doing during this flight is that for every little segment of its travel, as kind of illustrated by the little red vectors here in each segment of its travel, it's integrating its direction and distance, its direction relative to the sun and the distance that it's flying, to keep up to date all the time an estimate of the direction home, which is shown as this kind of purple arrow pointing back towards its nest. So it has that home vector consistently being updated, and it can find its way home again afterwards. And in fact, as I said, a number of other insect species do this. Bees are particularly famous because they're actually able to communicate. Once they have this vector and they find the food, they can actually tell this vector to another bee, and the other bee can then go directly towards the food as well. So that's another story that I won't be getting into today, but what I will be trying to do is give you some insight into how bees are capable of doing this behavior. But first, maybe we can just compare this to, what a type of robot, which is a self-driving car, can do versus what insects can do. So self-driving cars have been a huge success for the robotics industry so far. They haven't quite taken over yet, but they're certainly doing much more than we might have expected them to be capable of even a decade ago. But they still require there to be conventionally structured roads, and they need to be supplied with a detailed 3D map from large-scale advanced data gathering to get all the information about exactly what the whole road layout is and what all the features are and what all the landmarks are along the road, etc., etc. Whereas an insect can typically deal with an entirely novel and completely unstructured terrain with minimal prior knowledge. So we can't, take an autonomous vehicle and take it out into the desert and let it go and expect it to find its way around, because it doesn't have all this pre-knowledge of where it's going. But the insects seem to be able to cope. And perhaps even more surprisingly, if you kind of compare the sensory systems of self-driving cars and insects, self-driving cars typically have multiple high-resolution cameras. They have very sophisticated range sensors that, by sending out a signal, get a reflected signal that tells them the depth of lots of things in the world, including laser and radar sensors. They have typically very accurate inertial motion units, so they can tell their own acceleration and maintain, have a clock ticking over for the wheels, etc. And then they also rely, one reason they've succeeded is that they can actually use a lot of external information. So they have external information from GPS and also from Wi-Fi that can help them to locate themselves approximately, and then the very final precision to be exactly in a lane on a road or whatever can be done through all these other sensors. Whereas insects have nothing like that. They have relatively low resolution vision. They have compound eyes made up of multiple ommatidia, which means that the actual pixel rate is very low, maybe about 2 degrees of resolution. But on the other hand, these eyes are typically quite omnidirectional. They can see in most directions. And also they have several specializations. For example, they're sensitive to ultraviolet light and to polarized light. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Otherwise, insects do have a lot of other senses. They have chemical and tactile senses. They do have proprioception that tells them how their own bodies are moving. And they get some information, as I've mentioned, potentially from their nestmates, but not the kind of information that typically would be coming to a car from GPS or Wi-Fi, or from this map that it's already being loaded with. So let me just talk a little bit more about why being polarization sensitive is important for insect navigation. And in fact, they use this polarized vision to obtain their direction relative to the sun. So as is kind of shown at the top of the slide there, given a particular sun position, the light will be polarized by the sky in a very particular pattern that kind of looks like these concentric circles around the sun, with stronger polarization in the opposite side of the sky to the sun. So for any particular any particular sun location, you get this pattern of polarization, both the direction, the angle of polarization, and the degree of polarization, as well as just the luminance, the brightness caused by the sun. And insect eyes are sensitive to this. They have a particular area on the top of the eye that's sensitive, has receptors that are sensitive to a particular direction of polarization. And in fact, they're sensitive. Each sensor has a kind of sensor for one direction and the 90 degrees direction. And what that means is if you take the difference of those two, you get rid of any of the just general luminance information, the overall intensity, and you end up with just the information about the degree of polarization. And then obviously, depending on which angle you place those sensors at, you will get some information about the angle of polarization, because you get the strongest response when the polarization matches that angle. And these sensors are distributed across the eye of the insect in such a way that it kind of matches this pattern in the sky. So what this allows us to do is to actually, or what allows the insect to do, is to reliably and accurately encode the heading direction relative to the sun, even if the sun is not visible. All you need is one little patch of sky, or a few little patches of sky, and you can reconstruct the location of the sun. And I've just kind of drawn this here in a little diagram. This is the kind of model that we've built, where we have this set of polarization sensors that are laid out as I've kind of shown in this dome here, and from that we can basically reconstruct this pattern of activity where we have a neuron in the system, in the brain of the insect, that responds best to a particular direction relative to the sun. And I've sort of drawn it this way because I'll come back to this in a moment. The fact that I've actually drawn these 8 directions here is not just a kind of simplification. We actually think this is exactly how it is encoded in the brain of the insect. Okay, so then another way that the insects use their visual system to get the information they need for navigation is to use optic flow. So optic flow is the kind of the pattern of motion happening in the world, and in particular it refers to the kind of pattern of motion that you see if you yourself are moving through the world. So here you have a little insect that's flying forward in the world, and that produces this flow of motion outwards from the center. And in the insect brain, again, we've recorded from neurons that have a particular response when they see an optic flow that corresponds to flying forward. So here you have a little bee that's being shown this kind of artificial optic flow going from front to back as though it's flying forward, and you get a strong response from the neuron. And then if you show it the opposite, the world, everything going from back to front, it doesn't respond, and it also doesn't respond if you have rotational motion. And in fact, it actually responds in a very regular way. So the faster that you make this artificial optic flow go past, the more the neuron responds. So in other words, it's reacting to the speed at which the animal is going through the world. And there's actually, it's even a little bit more subtle than that. And this is a kind of really nice thing that we discovered, was that in fact these neurons are not tuned. You'd think they should be tuned so you get the best response when you're going exactly forward and the motion is coming from exactly in front of you. But in fact, what we find is that on the left side, it's tuned to motion coming from 45 degrees to the left, and on the right side, it's tuned the other way. So we actually have 2 receptors that are tuned most to motion at these 2 different angles. And it turns out this is actually a very nice way for the flying animal to be able to understand what velocity it is moving over the ground rather than just its speed, because you can imagine a flying insect might often not actually be flying in exactly the direction it's facing, but perhaps the wind is moving it, or it's purposely side slipping, but it still wants to accurately detect how it's moving relative to the ground. So in kind of mathematical terms, this is called a kind of orthogonal basis. So here we have, if the animal is heading in this kind of dark arrow direction, sorry, that's the direction its head is facing, but its motion is actually slightly side slipping to one side of that, and it has these 2 receptors that respond best at 45 degrees to its own heading angle, then what you can see is that because it's side slipping, one of those will be slightly more activated and the other one will be a little bit less activated. So between the 2 of them, you're actually encoding the actual motion that's being traveled relative to the ground. And this is sometimes called holonomic motion, motion of a system that can go, it doesn't matter which way it's heading, it can still move in any direction. Okay, So let's go back to our comparison of self-driving cars and insects. Self-driving cars typically need very powerful computing, and this is just an example, and it's actually from a few years ago now, where a self-driving car system was using multiple GPUs to do 24 trillion deep learning operations per second, and that's quite a lot of computing. Okay, whereas an insect brain is tiny, less than the size of a pinhead. For a bee, it maybe has 100, maybe 1 million brain cells, but probably less than 1 million brain cells. And each of those brain cells has a processing speed of about 1 millisecond. And it's not a completely, direct comparison between, the number of bits in a computer and the number of brain cells. But on the other hand, if you say 24 trillion deep learning operations, then each brain cell is probably not doing a deep learning operation, something as complicated as that. So it seems like the insects have found some extremely efficient computational solution to the problem. So in the kind of remaining time, I'm going to try and explain what we currently know about that and how we've tested it on a robot. So this is the kind of question: how could the tiny brain of an insect be tracking its home location in a completely unknown world? So I've described to you two sets of neurons so far. So one set of neurons that respond to the sky polarization and one set that respond to the optic flow. And in fact, they both are found in the same region of the insect brain. Let me just go back. It's a very tiny region right in the middle of the insect brain. It's kind of encoded in blue in this little picture. And it's called the central complex because it's in the center and it's complex. And this nice picture of it is kind of showing some of the anatomy of some of the neurons, and it essentially looks like a bunch of spaghetti. And it might seem really impossible to understand what's going on in this kind of neural circuit. But as I said, one thing we do know about this neural circuit is that this sky polarization pattern, which I just mentioned, and neurons that respond to it are in fact found in this part of the brain. Okay, and they actually go to this kind of upper part of this central complex. And these experiments have shown that, as I described before, each possible direction that the animal could be going in is encoded in kind of successive columns across this area of the brain. So each column as you go has a different preference for a different heading direction. And then similarly, I already showed you that if we look at the response to optic flow, we get these neurons that respond to the speed at which the animal is going, and those neurons also go into the central complex, into a different part of the central complex, as I've kind of shown it here. So we have the two elements that we need to be able to integrate our speed and our direction to then track our home location. And what we also know from the anatomy that's been done particularly by one of my collaborators, Stanley Heinze, there are neurons deeper in this circuit that seem to actually connect these two things together. So they have the compass heading coming in here, they have the optic flow coming in here, and the neurons actually connect those two bits together. So I'm going to kind of show this a little bit more schematically because I hope it will be a little bit easier to understand what's going on. So we have these direction cells, so these cells that respond to the direction of motion. We have these speed cells, and then we have these cells in the middle here that get both of those inputs. So they get input from the direction cells and from the speed cells. And a small technicality, they actually get inhibited by the direction cells. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that for a particular vector of motion, we want to try and encode that somehow. And each memory cell is going to get the current speed input modulated by the directional input for its column. And what that means is that we're basically translating a vector of motion here, shown by this little vector, into an activity across these 8 columns, these 8 memory cell columns, where the activity is relative. The amplitude of the activity, the total amplitude, is relative to the length of the vector, and the peak of the activity or the trough in the activity is relative to the direction. So as I said, it's inhibitory. So the more you're going in one direction, the more strongly, the less the speed is counted, and the more you're going in the opposite direction, the more the speed is counted. So these 8 cells that have 8 different preferences for the direction respond in these different ways. And as you might have noticed, this is actually like a sine wave of activity. And this is actually a well-known mathematical way to encode a vector. You can encode any vector as a sine wave, where the phase tells you the angle of the vector and the amplitude tells you the length of the vector. So if you imagine this is the first little segment of motion, and then there's another segment of motion, which we can encode the same way. So it's encoded in the activity across these 8 cells. And now, because the direction is this way, that's the lowest activity, and the amplitude is a little bit different. It's not quite as long, so this amplitude is a little bit shorter, and so on. So what's nice about this is that what we can do is, instead of just encoding it this way, we can actually integrate these encodings. So in other words, we get this activity input, and then we get this activity input, and we just add them up as we go along. And if you do that adding up, you are adding this sine wave to this sine wave, and you get out this sine wave, which will have an amplitude that corresponds to the length of the addition of those 2 vectors, and a phase that corresponds to the angle of the addition of those 2 vectors. So in other words, you're doing a vector sum through this kind of mechanism of adding together sine waves across the activity of the columns. So I know that's quite a lot to take in, but I hope that the general idea maybe gets across. And it's actually interesting, even though this is now how we think it's happening in the brain of the insect, it was actually first proposed as a purely hypothetical model more than 20 years ago. Okay, I'll keep on, and then maybe if there's at the end there's some questions, I can clarify anything that's not clear. So then that gives us our encoding, but we want to actually also get home. We don't want to just know where home is, we want to get there. And this circuit also solves that problem for us. So the next layer in this circuit is this set of cells that we call the steering cells. And they also get input from these directions from the memory cells. And then we know that they go out and connect to the right and left steering of the animal. So one way to understand what's actually going on here is to redraw this circuit. So what we're going to do is take all these connections, which we know from the anatomy of the animal, but instead of showing them in this way as a kind of, in the way that they're kind of laid out in the brain of the animal, we're going to show them as they actually are topologically. And it turns out that topologically, this whole system forms this really beautiful circle. So even though it looks like, much too tidy for the spaghetti that I showed you earlier, this is in fact the connections, all those connections in the spaghetti laid out in a kind of logical fashion. And this is what they do. And I'll explain in a moment what that means. But the first thing to notice is the way I'm going to kind of describe this, what I said before for the memory cells. If you think of these set of orange memory cells here, that we said they encode, this vector sum as the activity across each of those columns. So from one, there's 8 columns, and each of them has a different activity. And the phase in that activity gives you the direction, and the amplitude gives you the length of the vector, okay? And that's the direction that you actually want to go home, okay? So that's the sum of all your inputs so far, that's the direction you want to go home. So that's this vector here again, I've just kind of drawn it a different way. And what we're saying is that if you kind of draw the activity of each of the neurons, you can draw it, I'm now kind of drawing this so that this is the same kind of activity. We have the most activity in this neuron, less in this one, less in this one. And the direction in which I've drawn these arrows is the preferred direction in those columns. Okay, so that lets us kind of then hopefully understand the next part. How the central complex does vector subtraction. So essentially, what happens is we have these two sets of memory cells, the light orange and the dark orange, and half of them, if you look at the connection from the input direction to these output cells, half of them shift clockwise. All the light orange ones shift clockwise, and all the dark orange ones shift anti-clockwise. And that's like taking this memory that I just told you about and shifting that memory round 45 degrees in one direction and round 45 degrees in the other direction. And these cells that are going to decide which way we go also get direct information from these direction cells. So this is the actual direction that you're facing at the moment. And what happens is that they therefore get these two bits of information and they can look at the difference. So all the left cells are saying, well, how well does my current direction match with the rotation of my memory clockwise? And then all the right cells are saying, well, how well does my current direction match with the rotation of my memory anti-clockwise? And what that's like doing is saying, well, if I wanted to go in my memory direction, if I turn to the left or if I turn to the right, if I rotated this way or rotated that way, which would be the closer to the memory that I have, okay? And so you basically just take the difference, and you can kind of see here, I've kind of illustrated that this is your current direction, and if you look at this rotating to the left, well, that doesn't match very well at all. Whereas if you look at rotating, your memory rotated to the right, it matches much better. So it kind of it cancels out, so you get this lower output. So the difference lets you know which way to turn, and we can use that directly to control the behavior. Okay, again, that's maybe quite a lot to take in a short time, but hopefully this might help a little bit. So this is a kind of illustration of what's going on in a simulated bee. So the bee is flying around, and you can see the inner circle is its current direction, and it's trying to keep heading in that direction. This is the memory circuit, which is charging up more and more in the opposite direction to the way it's going, i.e. it's pointing back towards its nest. And then we have these final set of cells that are going to control the bee to take it home when we tell it to go home, which is now. And that drives it directly back to the nest. And then if it overshoots the nest, because at the moment it's got no way to detect if it's got to the nest, it will actually automatically do a search behavior as well, because every time it goes away from the nest, its vector points it back towards the nest and it will come back again. And of course, we want to show that this actually works on a robot. So this is us testing this neural circuit on a robot itself. A flying robot in this case, and the flying robot has on its has a computer on it that's running with exactly this neural circuit that I just told you. It has a downward facing camera here on a gimbal, which just stabilizes the camera to keep pointing at the ground, and from that we get this optic flow to estimate the ground speed. So we see the world going past, and we can extract. As before, we have these two filters that are looking for motion at 45 degrees in each direction. And from that, we try and estimate the speed. But you also actually need to know the depth to get an accurate speed information, because obviously how fast the world goes past you underneath depends on how high you're flying. And so with that, we can actually estimate quite accurately our ground speed in the X and Y directions. So this is it in flight. So we send it off and we send it out on a long path with various wiggles and a few kind of large changes of direction. And then we let it try and come home using this neural circuit. So it's gone almost out of sight, but here it comes back again. And then it decides when it's going to stop, and then it would land. I haven't shown the landing, but it's very clear when it's come back and thinks it's finished. And we can measure each time, how much error is there with the distance that it's flown. And what we find in brief, in the real tests here in the real world, it actually, after flying for 150 meters, it's only getting about 2 meters of error on average. And we have several different simulated worlds we can do that make, the world much more complicated in terms of uneven ground and so forth. But it's still actually extremely reliable to get back home again. And then finally, We looked at what happens if you don't do this height compensation, and we found if you have a variable height, it's okay up to a few meters of height change, but not after that. And in fact, it's been observed in bees that when they are flying long distances, they do tend to try and keep a constant height above the ground. Okay, so let me come to my conclusions, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions. People often ask, well, what's the application of insect robotics? And it's true to say that, some of the requirements we have for particular types of robot problems may be rather different to ants or bees or whatever. So, we might need them to go to multiple different possible destinations, not just to food and back home. And also we have, important safety constraints. We need to be able to make guarantees about how safe they might be. But I think it's still very useful to consider some of these robust and redundant tricks, such as polarization sensing. If for some reason you don't have GPS, the GPS is distorted and you don't have another compass sensor, where most, standard magnetic compass, for example, doesn't work very well next to a motor. So polarization sensing might be quite a useful backup system. And then similarly, the importance of the insect brain has actually dedicated part of the brain to do these kind of hardwired vector operations, and maybe that's something we should think about for efficient systems, particularly if we're thinking about applications for smaller, cheaper navigating robots, such as in agriculture or environmental monitoring or in environmental cleanup. And then finally, another reason that I do this work is to try and gain insight into the brain function itself. So I'll finish there and just briefly say thank you to some of the people who helped with this work. So particularly the models that I talked about were built by Thomas Stone, Everpinis Garnis, and Jan Stankiewicz did the work on the flying robot that you saw. And my collaborator, Stanley Hines, did most of the work on the neurobiology. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Webb. That was really lovely to hear. And there's so many insightful points that you brought in. And we have a bunch of questions that we'll try to cover in the next 10 minutes. And of course, thereafter, we'll have the post-interaction session where our attendees can ask you questions. I must tell you that we've collected a bunch of questions from social media, YouTube, and our moderator in the next session will position all of them to you. Anyway, so the first question that we have over here in the Q&A tab is, what inspired you to study ants in particular?
So I should really thank one of my PhD students who first kind of got me to look at ants. But there's kind of two reasons. One is that, I think I've looked at lots of different insects and lots of different insect capabilities in the past, including how crickets localize sound and how flies use vision for stabilization and so on. But we got particularly interested in ants because we thought this navigation problem was one that's actually very relevant to robotics. If ants can do it, this kind of navigation, particularly in these unknown environments, that it would be useful for robots. And then the second reason for ants is that they're much easier to follow than bees. We've done more work on ants than bees just because it's easier to do the experiments. You can walk and follow what an ant is doing and pick up an ant and put it in a different place and see what it does. So some of the kind of behavioral studies are easier to do in ants than they are in bees. So that's a short answer, but hopefully.
Fantastic. Love the way you give credit to your PhD student. I think that's really nice. Okay, so the next question that we have here is, what are some other insects that you've studied while building robots? I know you mentioned bees and ants and dragonflies too, but what other insects have you studied?
Yes, yeah. So I started with crickets. Those were the first animals I studied. We looked both at the sound and also at how they sense wind. So they have very good sensors for escape behavior, where they can detect the wind front of something coming towards them and do an escape behavior. So we looked at that as well. And then we got very interested in how They can integrate different systems, so how they integrate their visual system and their sound processing system, and what happens when those two things come together. Then we've also looked at flies, and in particular fruit flies, and one reason to look at them is that the neuroscience of fruit flies is really far advanced. So there's some really very, very interesting work, and some of the ways, because you can genetically modify fruit flies easily, you can do things to make, for example, a particular brain cell in their fruit fly light up when they do a particular activity, or you can shine a light on them and change the activity of the brain cell. So that gives you a lot of control over trying to understand these mechanisms. And we've also worked on maggots, which are just the baby fruit flies, I guess. And on, what else? We're currently working on dung beetles, which also they also use this polarization information in the sky, and they've been shown, for example, to even use polarization from the moon as well to be able to navigate at night. So that's another one of the insects that we've studied.
Covered quite a variety there, I must say, Professor Webb. The next question that we have over here is, while building your robots, have you thought of making them conscious? I know that consciousness is a big debate going on in terms of AI, ethics, and robotics. So what's your take on this?
Right. Yeah. To be honest, I think one reason I started looking at insects was to try and avoid all the consciousness debates in AI, because it seemed simpler not to get into that. But now there are people now who are discussing, should we think insects are conscious or not? So it's not a completely finished debate. But I think then it comes down a lot to how you define consciousness and so on. But it's not, on the whole, I do tend to think of them more as little machines for the moment anyway.
Professor Webb, this is more of a basic question, but a very, very important one. We have a bunch of undergraduate students who are wondering which field to get into at this point of time, young budding scientists and technologists in the audience with us here today. While studying engineering, how do we know what stream to take? Robotics offers so many different streams. How do we know which to pick? They're studying humanoid robots, they're studying biorobots. How do we know which stream to pick, and how do we navigate our path through all of this?
Yeah, that is a difficult one, because part of the problem with this field is, of course, that it's changing fast, and we don't know what the next thing is going to be. And to be honest, it wasn't possible when I was an undergraduate to study even robotics or AI weren't undergraduate degrees. And I studied psychology, and then I also did mathematical statistics, and I did computer science. And at the time in my university, I was the only person who'd ever done that combination of subjects, and it looked ridiculous to do them. And it turns out it was absolutely perfect for doing, for modern AI to have that background. So I think really my best advice would be just what do you find really interesting? Study what you find interesting, and I guess don't stop studying something because it's difficult, because difficult things are usually worth learning. So do tackle things that are difficult, but also follow your interests, and the likelihood is that your instincts will be right and it will turn out to be useful. Yeah.
Thank you. That makes so much sense. I mean, so many of the researchers that have been joining us at India Science Festival have actively, propagated the idea of following what interests you, and things will fall into place. Just do research on what excites you, and you will end up doing something you like. So that's really a lovely takeaway. So we have some really interesting questions here. Since insects tend to move around in swarms, they interact? How do the the robots that you have designed interact? How do they self-guide themselves to the home position while inherently they tend to roam around in swarms?
Okay, so I think the short answer is it depends which insects, because a lot of insects do not roam around in swarms, and in particular the ones that I've been studying, the desert ants and the bees tend to do much more individual foraging. So they swarm in in the location, their home is a nest with multiple animals, and it's really important that they're a group because they bring food back to the group, and that gives them a very strong motivation to come back. They don't just eat the food when they find it, they have to bring the food back to feed the others in the nest. So the fact that they're a colony is crucial, but the individual insect doing its navigation in the cases that I've been talking about is not actually being helped by any other insect, or even particularly interacting with any other insect when it does it. When people think of ants, they normally think of like chemical trails and ants following a chemical trail, and that you'll have a whole line of ants. And there, of course, they are providing communication to each other. But even with a chemical trail, an ant that has gone several times on the same chemical trail will start to learn for itself what visually that looks like, and be able to follow that trail. Even if you took the chemicals away, you could still follow that route. So there's a kind of really interesting interaction, but on the whole, the insects we've studied, we've looked at individually rather than the group behaviors. Yeah.
For answering that question, Professor Webb, the next question that we have over here is, do you think that the ethical implications of building biorobots are something that technologists have to keep in mind while entering this field? There is so much debate going on about ethics and AI. What's your take on the same?
Scott, right, yeah. So I do other robotics. Sorry, are we there?
You're back. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So I don't think biorobotics is significantly different from other fields in that sense, from robotics in general. There are obviously some things we would maybe prefer robots didn't do. And similarly, there's some things, that we maybe don't want AI to do. I think the problem is the risk, at least at the moment, is much less about, as I said, robots are actually, when it comes to acting in the world, incredibly incompetent for the most part. And we should be much more worried about the more abstracted AI, that's kind of running on the internet and and making multiple decisions for us in the world at the moment. And I think we've got far more ethical issues to worry about there than we do with robots.
Thank you. I think we have time for the last two questions now. One question that we have here for you is, what are the various types of sensors that you use while building your biorobots?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have mostly used visual sensing, but as I said, we use specialized sensing. So, for example, polarization. I also mentioned ultraviolet. We did a whole series of studies on how you can use ultraviolet sensing to get the shape of the skyline, and that can be very useful for navigation, and that's something that insects do. I have looked at auditory systems. I've looked at tactile systems. I've looked a little bit at chemical sensing, but it's just very messy, so I haven't done that so much. I think we do sometimes underappreciate how many sensors an insect has. So even if you just think of single insect antennae, it's got hundreds of mechanical sensors, hundreds of chemical sensors. Already there's a lot more sensing going on than, and typically robots, they might have really good vision, but then they have very poor feedback sensing for their individual joints, or touch sensing and so on, whereas I think that's actually very important to try and get these interactions with the world to work. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very insightful. So Professor Webb, in your experience in working in AI and robotics, since you particularly work on the interface of studying animals and robots, do you think this is a very good platform to incorporate the understanding of both fields with children? Have you had an opportunity to work with kids? And if so, have they been perceptive in building robots, and how has their reaction been to understanding both fields?
Right, that's potentially quite a complex question. I have done a little bit of work with children, maybe more often on somewhat simplified systems, but very useful. So some people might be familiar with, there's a very good book called Vehicles by Breitenberg, where he kind of describes very simple sensory motor systems, but how they actually produce more complicated behavior than you can imagine. And so we have a kind of workshop that we've done with children multiple times where they actually get to build one of these vehicles and find out what happens as you connect sensors to motors. And I think it gives them a lot of insight, into both, what robotics is about, but also the fact that, if you look at an animal behavior, how can you start to understand what is actually causing the animal to behave in the way it does? So that's one set of work that we've done. And I think it's a really, I think there's a really close connection. I think we really should let those fields interact a lot. So.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I remember that one talk that you had conducted. There was one young adult in the audience who came up to us and told us that there is absolutely no way that I could have imagined building robots while keeping animal behavior in mind. So it's such a fascinating field of study, and you're absolutely right. We need to definitely look into more of it. And with that, Professor Webb, brings me to my last question for the evening. What do you think is the role played by public engagement platforms such as India Science Festival in building bridges between science and society? How important do you think science communication is, and how do we go about bridging the gap between science and society?
It's also not a short question to answer, perhaps, but I mean, I think it's brilliant, the kind of thing that you're doing, and I'm very keen on science engagement and making sure people don't think of scientists as these remote people off doing things, in their ivory towers or whatever, but that actually understand, why we do it, why we find it fascinating, and then, and I guess perhaps to just give a slightly different answer, obviously people are going to say it's good because it's good. I think what's important perhaps is to communicate to them why that we do it. People often, the question you often get asked by the public is, well, what is it useful for? Okay, and that's a reasonable question, but I don't think it's the reason that we do it most of the time. I think the reason scientists do science is because they want to know the answer, because they think it's fascinating. And I think it's really important to try and communicate. It's just like an artist, people don't say, well, what is it useful for when an artist produces something? I feel like they shouldn't, it's the same way for a scientist. People should say, well, actually, it's worth doing just because it's really nice to find out the answer to this question. That's worth doing in itself. I think any civilization should be prepared to say, well, we want some people to do art, and we want some people to do music, and we want some people to do science just for the pure joy of it. So.
That makes so much sense. I mean, we have had researchers who have said on our platform that just curiosity-driven science is a valid reason to do science. We shouldn't have to explain anything. We shouldn't have to give more reasons to do science. But
then it is important to communicate, why it's so interesting. And so that's where it's important to have these platforms where you can say, well, this is what we do, and isn't that actually, I've yet to find someone who's not been interested when I've said I build insect robots. So.
On that note, Professor Webb, thank you so much for being a part of India Science Festival. It was a real pleasure listening to your talk. And thank you for patiently answering all these questions. Of course, I'd like to tell all of our attendees that now you can head over to the Zoom meeting room where Professor Webb will have a closer interaction with attendees. So there's a link in the chat. So make sure you head over to the post-session interaction room where Professor Webb will meet you. And on behalf of the entire team, Professor Webb, thank you so much for joining in. It was an absolute pleasure. And next time we hope to host you in India, offline, on ground, and hopefully get to interact with you on a much closer level. So thank you so much.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Hey!